Okay, guys, we're probably going to take some of the weirdest notes ever because we had two foldables and one with windows, which is this one you see before you. Hopefully we've got it put into your composition notebooks. And the title, we're on lesson 2-6. We're going to be studying about percents and estimating percents. So this first page, estimating percents, is going to be how we would figure out different amounts of percent of a number. So 10%, 20%, 25%, 50%, and 75%. Second page, we have a foldable, and we're going to talk about how to estimate percents. So let's see, today's date is 12/5/18. Okay, so in order for us to do this, I have a picture of each one of these flaps opened, and we'll do it one flap at a time. So let's go to the next page, and let's talk about 10%. So first thing we're going to do is color in what does 10% look like. So we have a hundreds grid. It's a 10 by 10 grid. So if I color in one length of 10, that's going to be 1/10. How do I know? 10 out of 100 simplifies down to 1 out of 10. So that fraction, that 1/10, is what we're going to use to figure out 1/10 of a number. Now I have two choices. I can take that 1/10 and I can multiply it. So multiply by 1/10. So if I want to figure out what 10% of a number is, I can multiply it by 1/10. Now, I can also do the inverse of those. So the inverse of multiply is to divide by, and the inverse, remember that multiplicative inverse, the reciprocal of 1/10 would be 10. I could divide by 10. So that's how I could figure out 10% of a number. Multiply by 1/10 or divide by 100. Okay, let's go to the next flap. Let's talk about 20%. So with 20%, I have one column here of 10, and then I'm going to get a second one. Okay, so what I did is I colored in 20 out of the 100 little squares. Now I can simplify, divide out of 10, which gives me 2 out of 10, and I can go one step further, and I end up with 1/5. That's the fraction that I'm going to use if I want to multiply. So I can take a number, and I can multiply it by 1/5, and that will tell me what 20% of your given number is. The other option is to do the inverse, and I could take whatever given number I have, and I could divide it by the reciprocal of 1/5 is 5, and that would tell me what 20% would be. Okay? Pretty straightforward. All right, let's go to flap 3 to 25%. All right, this one's going to be a little bit more interesting to color. So it's going to start off looking like the 20%, right? There's 20. But now I got to get to 25. So I'm going to color in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 blocks from the next row. So what did I do? I had 25 out of 100 colored in, and when I reduce that by 25, top and bottom, I get 1/4. Okay? So with 1/4, that's what I could multiply by. I can multiply my given number by 1/4. That's one strategy of figuring out 25% of a number. Or I could do the inverse. I could divide by the reciprocal 4. So those are my two options when I want to figure out 25% of a number. All right, now there's a lot of ways I could show that 25%. I could have done it a 5 by 5 box. That would have worked out too. So but this was the way I chose to do it this time. So let's go ahead and talk about the next value. How about 50%? How do I figure out 50% of a number? Well, kind of similar to what we've been doing. I can color in not one row or column, 2, 3, a total of 4 of them. A total of 4 of them. A total of 5 of them. Yeah, math teacher can't count. Oh, yeah. Okay, so I have 50 of those little squares or cubes out of 100 colored in. When I simplify, take out a 0, divide top and bottom by 5, and I get a half. So if I want to figure out what 50% of a number is, I can do this. I can multiply by 1/2. Okay, so that's one way to do it. Or I can do the inverse. I could divide my given number by the reciprocal 2, and that will tell me what 50% of the given value is. Okay, here we go. Last one. Let's figure out how we deal with 75%. So 75%, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I'm going to color in 7 columns. Who said math's not fun? Look at the coloring we get to do. Pretty awesome. So that's only 70%. So to get to 75, I got to color in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more of those little cubes. So in total, I colored in 75 out of 100 of the total cubes. Now, if I simplify 75 hundredths, I can divide by 25, and that will give me 3/4. Okay, here comes the fun bit. So, how can I figure out what 75% of a number is? Well, I could multiply by 3/4. Now, I could divide by the reciprocal 4/3, but then that's going to get a little bit weird. So we're going to break it down into 2 operations. So what I could do is take my given number and I could multiply it by the numerator. So I can multiply by 3, then divide by 4. How did I know what to multiply by and what to divide by? Well, I'm going to multiply by the numerator, 3, and then I'm going to divide by the denominator, 4. So if I want to figure out 75%, these are my 2 options. Multiply my number by 3/4, or multiply my number by 3, and then divide that product by 4. Okay? So that's giving us fast, easy ways of how to figure out 10%, 20%, 25%, 50%, and 75%. All right, this moves us on to the second foldable. So this one says find percents of numbers mentally and estimating percents of numbers. So here's one of the problems. Photo's a little bit fuzzy, but here's what's interesting. You can still read it, and you've got a clean copy in front of you. Now, just like yesterday, I'm going to give you guys a word that I want you to put at the top of the first set of notes on the first page, and it's going to be the word purple. And purple stands for A, the color of your foldable, and B, my mom's favorite color. Okay? So that's what the outside looks like. Now let's open it up. And here we go. So what we're going to do is we're going to practice all these different ideas. But if we understand the numbers that we were just talking about, this is going to go by so fast. So 10% of a number simply means, and this is where we go with what we talked about before, 1/10 of a number. So 1/10 goes there. In other words, we can just blank a number by 10 in order to find 10%. Now remember, what math did we do? With the 10, we divide. So divide a number by 10 in order to find 10%. So here's the beautiful thing. You know how we divide by 100? Divide means going left by one space for 1 0. So 10% of 300, move the decimal, let's try that again. Move the decimal point over once, and I get 30. In 72, 10% of 72, move the decimal point left once, and I'm going to get, 7.2. Okay? 10% of 4, going to move the decimal left once, and I'm going to get 4/10 or 0.4. 250, I'm going to divide by 10, move the decimal point over once left, and then I get 25.0, which is the same as 25. And then I should have separated this in 2 pages, and I could have written a little bit better. Oh well, live and learn, huh? So then I have 10% of 45, I'm going to divide by 10, and that's going to give me 4 5/10. I want to find 10% of 10 and divide by 10, and I get 1.0, or better yet, just 1. So here comes the fun part. Well, if I understand this idea of finding 10% of a number is dividing by 10, which is shifting the decimal point to the left once, I can use that idea in conjunction with something else to help me figure out 20%, 30%, 40%, and so on. So these are all the percents that end in a 0, okay? So it says, well, since they're multiples of 10, all we must do is find 10% and then blank it by the appropriate number. And that word there is going to be multiply. So in other words, what we're trying to do is figure out how many 10% are in the percent number that we're talking about. So here's our examples at the top. It says 20% is the same as 10% times 2. There's 2 10% inside of 20%. 30% is the same as 10% times, you got it, 3. Because there's 3 10% inside of 30. What about 40%? Well, 40% is 10% times 4. How do I know that? 4 10% fit into 40. Okay, so how are you going to use this? This is awesome. I love this. So I'm going to figure out 20% of 70. Well, first off, I look at the 20% and I notice I'm going to get 2 10%. I take the 70 and I divide by 10. So I'm going to get 2, and 10% of 70 is 7. So the answer is 14. Isn't this brilliant? This is so easy to get these answers. Let's keep going down. So I notice with 30%, there's 3 10% in it. I'm going to take 10% of 40 is 4. So I'm going to get 3 4s, which is a total of 12. Easy peasy. 70%. Well, there's 7 10% in that guy. And I'm going to divide by 10 to figure out 10%. So 80 divided by 10 is going to give me 8. So I'm going to get 7 times 8. And so 70% of 80 is 56. Can you believe how fast we can get these answers? Okay, 40%. Well, there's 4 10%. I'm going to divide by 10, which is going to move the decimal point to the left once. That gives me 4 times 30, which is 120. Okay? How many 10% are in 20? 2. I move the decimal point left one time to figure out 10% of 75, and I get 2 times 7.5. When I multiply that out, I'm going to get a total of 15. And then last one in this section, I want to figure out 60% of 60. So there's 6 10% in 60. I'm going to figure out 10% of 60, move the decimal point to the left once, and I get 6 times 6, or 36. So great. All right, let's talk about 50%. We already did that in our foldable. And 50% is going to be 1/2 of a number. So just divide a number by 2. Again, we wrote that on our foldable. So it says 50% of 30 is, well, I'm just going to divide 30 by 2, and I get the answer of 15. 50% of 62 is, well, I'm just going to divide by 2, and I get 31. 50% of 8 is, I'm just going to divide by 2, and I get 4. 50% of 220 is, I'm just going to divide by 2, and I get 110. So simple. Okay? All right, let's try 25%. Let's do, I don't even remember, I'm just picking random colors now. So 25% is, if you remember from the other foldable, 1/4 of a number, so we're just going to divide a number by 4. So it says 25% of 40 is, divide by 4, and I get 10. 25% of 32 is, well, I'm just going to divide by 4, and 32 divided by 4 is 8. 25% of 12 is, I'm just going to divide by 4, and I get 25% of 12 is 3. Now here comes a trick. The next one's going to ask us for 75% of 16. So if you remember what we wrote, our second choice said multiply by 3 and divide by 4. We're going to do that in reverse. Why? Because I'm going to take 25% of the number. That means I'm going to take 16 and I'm going to divide it by 4. That's going to give me 4. But then it says I'm going to multiply by 3. So 75% of 16, or 3/4 of 16, is 12. Man, that's pretty cool. So again, what did I do here? Divide by 4, multiply by 3. Okay? So it says, what about 15% or 35% or 45%? So these are all the percents that have 5 in the ones column. Well, I said, well, wait a second. Let's just be smart about this. How do I get 15%? Well, isn't it just 10% plus 5%? And 35%, isn't that just 30% plus 5%? And 45%, isn't that just 40% plus 5%? Okay, so let's talk about this guy. Up at the top it says, to find 5% of a number, we just need to find, guess what it is? Half of 10%. We can use 10% and 5% of a number to find these types of percents. So let's try it out. 15%. So first thing I'm going to do is divide by 10. So 40 divided by 10 is 4. Then I'm going to take that guy, the 10% number, and I'm going to take half of that. So that gives me 4 plus 2, and I get 6. Isn't this fantastic? This is so simple. I love this. It's kind of messy. I apologize. All right, so next guy. This one's going to be a little tricky. First off, I'm going to figure out 10%. So I'm going to divide by 10, and that gives me 2. But that's only 10%, and I want to figure out 40%. So to get 40%, I'm going to go ahead and multiply that answer by 4. Okay, but now I got to figure out what 5% is. Well, remember what 10% was. It was 2. So I'm going to take half of that. So what do I have? 8 plus 1, and my answer is 9. All right, what's 15% of 120? Well, let's figure out what 10% is. So I'm going to divide by 10, and I get a 12. And then I'm going to do 5% is half of the 10%. So I get 12 plus 6, and the answer is 18. All right, let's try the next guy. 35% of 80. Well, first off, we're going to figure out what 10% is. We're going to divide by 10. We get 8. But I need 30%. So that means I'm going to take 3 of those 8s. And then I want to figure out what 5% is. So I'm going to take our 10% value and cut it in half. So 3 times 8 is 24. 8 divided by 2 is 4. And the grand total, 28. So cool. All right, next guy, 65% of 60. First, I start with figuring out what 10% is. So to get 60%, I'm going to take my number and multiply it by 6. So I get 6 times 6. Now I'm going to take the 10%, which is the 6, and I'm going to cut it in half. That represents the 5%. So I get 36 plus 3 for a grand total of 39. All right, last one in this group, 35% of 40. First, I'm going to figure out what 10% is. And then to get 30%, I'm going to take 3 of those. So I'm going to get 3 times 4. Now I'm going to take that 10%, 4, and I'm going to cut it in half. That's my 5%. So let's see what we got. 12 plus 2, and that gives me a total of 14. Now, it says to estimate percents. We're going to round the percent and round the number if need be. So how are we going to estimate the following percents? So this one says you have 49% of 82. So what I want to do is figure out a good way of doing this. So I'm going to say 49 is about 50%, and then 82 is about 80. All right, guess what, guys? We're going to take half of 80. How? We're going to just divide by 2. The answer is 40. So cool. All right, what about the next one? So notice what I'm doing. I'm generally going to round to numbers that end in 0. So this is going to become simple math. So 67% is almost 70%, and 31 is about 30. Okay, so on this one, what we're going to do is figure out what 10% is. So that would be a 3, and then I'm going to multiply it by 7. That's going to give me the 70%. So remember, we got 7 of these. So that ends up, 3 times 7 is 21. Okay, 12% of 128, well, that'd be about 10% of 120. So that's easy. To find 10%, I'm going to divide by 10, and that's going to give me 12. And then over here, 32% of 147, well, that's about 30% of 150. So remember how this is going to work. I'm going to do it differently than I did the one before, that 70% one. I'm going to get 3 10%, and 10% of 150, I just moved the decimal point over left once, is 15. So when I multiply, I get 45. 19% of 419, well, that looks to be about 20% of 420. So remember what I've got here. I've got 2 10% inside of that 20%. So I'm going to take 2 times, and I'm going to figure out what 10% of 420 is. That's going to be 42. And now I multiply 2 times 42, which is 84. Okay. Now, if I was a good girl, instead of writing equals, I would say approximately equal, right? Because we are estimating here. But I'm a bad girl and it's late. Oh well. 88% of 58? Well, that's about 90% of 60. So remember, we've got 9 10% inside of 90. And we're going to multiply that by 10% of 60, divide by 10, and we get a 6. Multiply straight across, and we get 54. Okay. Jack's meal costs $18.73. Estimate a 15% tip. So, looking at this problem, what do you think would be a good estimate for $18.73? Yep. Oh, that's a terrible color. I'm sorry. Let's try something darker. I'm going to say that's about $20. So how am I going to do 15%? Remember what we're going to do. We're going to do a 10% plus a 5%. So 10% of 20 is going to give me a 2. 5% is going to be half of 10%. So that gives me 2 plus 1, or a grand total of a tip of $3. All right? Sally, her meal costs $39.18. That's going to be about $40. We're going to estimate a 20% tip. So remember what we're going to do is we're going to figure out what 10% is and double it. Why? Because it said 20%. So let's figure out what 10% is, and 10% of 40 is 4. So we're going to take double that to make 20%. So we get 2 times 4 is 8. So Sally would pay an $8 tip. All right, we made it through, gang. A lot of math, but it's all in our head. Isn't that awesome? All right, have fun with this.